management for about 15 years. As a CFO, it's been quite a ride. From an EDI perspective, I've got a spot of autism and a spot of ADHD, which manifests.
Thanks, Abby.
Hello, everyone. So I've been working as a school business professional for over 6 years across primary and secondary settings, and most recently I'm a trust financial accountant at a trust. I think for myself, obviously, in terms of EDI, there's personal experiences that I've drawn on to ensure that I can make the workplace work for me in terms of work-life balance and being a young mum, and obviously in terms of things to support my religious observances.
Thank you. And Tamsin, we come to you just with a little bit of background about you and introduction. You have to hold your mics really up close to your mouth, sorry.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Tamsin Bowers-Brown. I have worked in higher education for the past 23 years and motivated by challenging inequity in education. So my subject area is education and my research is on inequity.
Thank you. So let's start with, what does equity, inclusion and diversity mean to you personally? I should come to you first, Tamsin. Is that okay?
Yeah, so I guess I have a question for everyone, which is around how often do we sit and question our own kind of understanding of equity from a personal perspective. So, do we really understand the privileges that we hold? And I always think back to why I'm doing this work. And the reason that I started this work was the way that I was brought up. So my mum used to tell me stories about reading to her illiterate grandmother, and that she would write her letters for her, she would read for her. They were from a travelling show people background, and my mum went in and out of different family care, and the thing that changed her life circumstances was becoming a teacher. So she did a teaching certificate. She did it with 2 young children, and eventually it meant that it changed the direction of mine and my 3 siblings' lives. So the power of education, but the fact that education needs to be equitable to reach those different groups of children, to understand that there are children in poverty, that there are children that may be walking to school seeing flags around them and this global unrest that actually may mean that their engagement in the classroom could be particularly difficult. So it's about, for me, it's about how we make our environments inclusive so that all our children can thrive and achieve the things that they're capable of, regardless of their background and their circumstances.
Yeah, really understanding each other, isn't it? And looking beyond what we can see.
Yeah.
I think we heard that this morning as well, didn't we, from Serena? Shall I come to you, Lucia?
Thank you, Beth. So for myself, it's having the confidence and empowering the workforce to have those open, honest conversations, so that when you do go for a prospective job as part of a career move, making sure that it works for you. So, for example, it could be an all-year-round contract. So I've moved from the corporate sector to the education sector to gain that work-life balance and have those holidays with my children. So it's having those conversations, going for a permanent all-year-round job, but then having the conversation, well, could we do term time only with plus days, and then agreeing certain working patterns, and then I could be home to take the boys to mosque, for example, because Dad does the morning routine. And then I think, for me personally, working in the school setting, I think a lot of that came from wanting to give back to the community. So for children, it's making sure that they have access to all the provisions within the school, and it could be something as simple as the free school meal children, making sure that you're pricing that free school meal so that they can get a nutritional, well-balanced budget, but then from a finance perspective, making sure that whatever funding we're receiving from the GAGs, the General Annual Grant, and whatever catering contract we've got in place, you're fulfilling your needs from a profit point of view, or you're achieving a balanced budget. And then touching on what you mentioned, Tamsin, so obviously with, like you said, the flags, that is quite upsetting and disappointing, because me and my children have grown up in, we were born here, welcome everybody, no matter what your skin colour is or your hair colour is. So I think for me, again, it's making sure you've got that engagement at school level from children at a young age where you're treating them that everybody is an equal, and we should all have access to the same provision so that we can achieve the best possible outcomes for ourselves, so that we can thrive in this world, which when you leave the school environment is a big bad world, and it can be cruel. But if we teach our children to be kind from a young age, I think we will teach everybody to be kind in the world, and I think that's important to me.
That's a really good point on that holistic approach. But just going back to where you started, I think you talked about looking at that flexibility as well, didn't you, around what you needed as an individual. Did you feel that in the education sector that employers were receptive to that? You know, was it advertised in a way that you could suggest that you might want to work different hours, different points, or did you ask an interview? How did you make that work? That's an interesting point.
So interestingly enough, in one of my first, when I was in the corporate sector, I was actually 3 months pregnant, and I went for a new job. And my husband was like, make sure you tell them you're pregnant. And I was like, no. And my sister was a manager at the time in West Midlands, and she was like, don't tell them, because as a manager, if you told me you were pregnant and you were going to go on maternity leave, I wouldn't employ you. They're not meant to do that. Those biases do exist because it's more work for your manager than recruit somebody else to cover your maternity. So there was an element, and I was right to do this, there's an element of not sharing, for example, certain things about yourself to make sure you land the job that you're dreaming to aspire in. And from a school perspective, what I did was, and I guess it was slightly cheeky, but it worked for me in all my settings. So most of the jobs I applied for, they were permanent all year round. Thankfully, my academic composition and my background meant that I could meet all the criteria within the job specification. So I would get shortlisted, and without blowing my own trumpet, most of the jobs that I applied for, I ended up securing the role. So I'm walking in with a sense of confidence, but not cockiness, answering all the interview questions, and then upon job offer, I would ask questions. And I'd probably know at that point if I would achieve the outcome that I was desiring, but then at the same time, the request, it wouldn't just be selfish and for myself, it would to meet business needs. So for example, working in a finance setting, I would have to deal with month end. So when I'm offering term time only, I'm also offering plus days, so working during those periods where I know it's going to be month end, but then also asking for that flexibility of could I work from home during those plus days. And then in the current role that I'm in, I'm pretty sure it was advertised as an all year round role. So I asked for term time only plus 20 days because it was a financial accountant role, so I knew I'd be involved in the year end procedures. But then I also asked for, and this was very different to everybody else in the workplace who normally does an 8-4 working pattern. So I asked for a 7:30, 3:30 so I could get home in time to take the boys to mosque. And I think I asked those questions at the very beginning, and I think it's important to be open and honest to prospective employers, and it helps manage expectations because they'll be able to see from your application and how you answer questions in interviews if you're a good fit. And then for me, at this point in time, the jobs that I've gone for want a better word, it needs to work for my family. So I've said to my husband, my current CEO, I'm happy to work all year round when both my boys are in secondary school because I know I can give that time. And plus my boys, they don't want to chill with mum anymore. So they're too cool for mum now. So it's just, that would be the right time for me to move away from the home environment in that sense. And I would feel less guilty as well because we all feel these pressures as a mum. We feel as though we've got these roles that we need to fulfill. And for me, it's not just because of my traditional culture, it's because of who we are. So I think for me, it's finding the role that works for you and then having those open, honest conversations and navigating, being flexible about what you can offer to still fulfill business needs.
Fantastic, but that sounds like the culture in your organisation, you had that psychology security that I think Sabrina talked about, and that's how do we build that culture, which we'll come on to. But let's go back to the equity, inclusion, diversity point that we started with. I mean, what does that mean for you?
Okay, for me personally, it's having the structure and the culture within your workplace to ensure that everybody gets an equal opportunity, and understanding that all your stakeholders do not come from the same place of equal privilege. So how do you ensure that everybody gets an equal opportunity to achieve an outcome, access a service, and do their best? What structure and culture from my perspective personally? I mean, I've got a 20-year-old with severe autism, non-verbal, inhibition from cancer, you name it, the whole nine. And being able to, I've also been myself on spectrum with ADHD. My body can get to work at 8 o'clock, my brain kind of makes it in by 10:30. So you won't get the same outcome if I have to go there early, but I will if I have to. And to be able to have that conversation with anyone, it's got to be the sort of organization that has the culture that welcomes that sort of conversation. And if you make that adjustment for me, you will get the outcomes, but how is everyone else? And SLT going to respond to that? And that's a test of it. Starting point for me is I look at a job advert and they say, do you have a disability, or if you need access, generic email address at our trust, school, or local authority, or call general number to discuss sensitive personal information. And I'm thinking, why would you think that's a good avenue? This is something personal, something sensitive. I shouldn't have to be emailing a generic address about it. So this is all platitudes and they're not ready for it. So then just lots of areas I look at that help me determine. Sometimes you want to visit first and I have the conversation to get the feel for the environment. I don't think I'm useless and I don't think I'm lazy, but if you put me in an environment where I have to work the same hours as everyone else the way they work, it's just not going to work and you'll get the best out.
I think that's a really good point though, isn't it? Because body will reflect on, I think the same generic email address has really stung me, and I thought actually, we shouldn't do that, should we? I mean, that could be a barrier to somebody applying for a job that is absolutely the best candidate for our school, our organisation, and we've never even met them because they've been turned off before they've even met us coming to our organisation. So I think we should all reflect on that. So we started to touch on this. So what is key in the workplace to support all pupils and colleagues to thrive? I think we said getting them to even apply is probably the starting point, but once we've got colleagues internally with us, our communities, how do we help them thrive? Do you want to start, Abby, expanding on where you were?
Yes, still comes out what I call structure and culture. We've got to be brave enough to allow these conversations without repercussion, because, like you said, you don't want to tell them they're pregnant because they're going to be, and I think that's a test of how we come across and how we present ourselves. I've been on the other side of the table at recruitment where people do work out, oh, she's this age, but at least she's not going to have any more kids, so they're within our, or that one's not going to have kids. And I keep thinking, we should be having this conversation, It's not relevant. It's not as relevant as you think, because a lot of people will get locked up in a short space of time. They will have some people on the neurodiversity spectrum will do 2 weeks work in 3 hours. But it takes them a long time. So the amount of what you call, when you have to sort of go back and build momentum might take more than others. But when they go much faster. So it's sort of giving the space to understand these different things. Occupational health is there for a reason, I believe. And it's not just a paper exercise. They will tell you a bit more about these things if you ask the right questions, and they will help you support them. Helping individuals to be aware of themselves and what they need as well. Because some people know they're frustrated and they can do better, they just don't know where and how. Having a supportive environment will help them sit back and reflect. I think getting people who are, neurodiverse is important because the students will have the same experience, and when we're having decisions and conversations, having a neurodiverse person tell you it's not going to work, or you can do it differently, or you can make, there's this carve out. It's usually quite helpful, and I think it helps with outcomes. And like I said, a lot of people that I've seen, dyslexia, dyscalculia, some people are enough, we shouldn't. At the end of the day, they bring so much into the workplace in areas that we actually can't see. I have been in deputy head and I some years ago thought we would go into usually asked to repeat what was said, boys were usually asked to solve. And then when they were asked the questions, on average, within 5 seconds, someone jumps in to rescue the girls. Usually a boy will help her out or the teacher jumps in. Boys would get 20 plus seconds to think and resolve. And I remember we kept thinking, this is interesting. There's actually this difference in how we approach them, even from a gender perspective. So we started to look at those. And then in another area, we thought we would look at disciplinaries, outcomes of disciplinaries by characteristics. Interestingly, the people on the formal and severe end of the outcomes shared certain characteristics, and the people at the informal and lenient end shared certain characteristics. And we thought we would review the notes, we'd review the processes, and we would sort of review how we got to where we are. And it was actually quite interesting, and I would challenge you to try to look at things like that.
Yeah, so data-driven. We talked about that a lot, haven't we, over the last couple of days. Can I come to you, Tamsin, about how we support colleagues and pupils to thrive?
So for me, I would start, I'm going back to thinking about what our institutional values are. So, and agreeing that collaboratively and co-creating what that means in practice, because we often see mission statements, value statements, and they can become quite abstract. So how do we actually move from something being an abstract value that potentially you can all subscribe to because it sounds like a great thing to do, to actually living those values, because that's what's going to make the difference for our pupils and our colleagues. So, for example, when you were talking earlier, Nazia, about not saying that you were pregnant on application, it's, if we know what our values are, then we shouldn't be thinking about colleagues coming into interview or coming into spaces and having to even consider those things, because we want people that are value aligned. So if our policies reflect our values and we can see that lived out in practice, then that is what is going to support us to thrive, because we're in a place that we feel valued and that we want to be, and also that our children want to be. The second thing is that we look at all these policies through the lens of equity. So if we have a behavioural policy, for example, we don't just think about this is the behaviour that we're trying to achieve. We're thinking about how those outcomes or those expectations impact on different groups of learners. So, for example, the cultural differences that may mean that those behaviours can be interpreted differently, or for as someone with ADHD also, for neurodivergent learners, how does that behaviour policy impact on them? So, I've been to a number of presentations where behaviour has been spoken about as a key priority of the MAP, for example. And there'll be things like, we expect our children to track the teacher, to pay attention, to nod, and to smile. And some of these things are really inappropriate in terms of a neurodivergent child who may just not be able to do that. So I think determining our values and then thinking about all our policies, whether they're colleague policies or people policies, through that equity lens.
Thank you. So, can we come to you, and you can probably give us what's happening in your schools, for examples of how you're ensuring that your colleagues and pupils are thriving.
Definitely. So, obviously in terms of staff, it's making sure you've got those policies in place and empowering staff, and making sure your leaders are on board as well, because yes, there may be a policy in place and yes, it ticks a box, i.e. the Equality Act 2010, but is it actually a lived-in policy, like Tamsin mentioned? It needs to be authentic. Your staff need to feel as though that policy is actually embedded in the workplace, in the workforce, and it's something that is actively being used. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. With pupils, for example, it's making sure you're creating that environment, and so it's the implementation of policies, adapting the curriculum as well to make sure that all your learners' varying needs are met in the classroom environment, so that so you're adapting your teaching and learning style so that they can actually understand what's being taught and excel in an exam environment. And then also with activities and making sure your visuals and resources are adapted so that learners from different backgrounds can actually access it, and making sure that they're also aware of bias and discrimination and the protected characteristics. And that applies to staff as well, because it could be unconscious bias. And I think if pupils have role models that are actually living and breathing the values, then that will become second nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've talked about developing policies, haven't we? Someone is developing that policy. So often it can be seen that, you know, somebody's leading on it, an individual is leading around the policy development in EDI. But do you see it as an individual or a collective responsibility when we talk about EDI? Shall we start with you, Abby?
In terms of I think everyone's got a part to play there. And I know they say, oh, here's an EDI champion, but they can't know everything, they're not specialists. They're just there to make sure that it's working, to help to monitor it. I think back to one study by Hofstede called Cultural Dimensions, which I think everyone needs to be aware of. We have in the workplace, I think about 4 generations now, who do not speak the same language or work from the same dictionary. And then we've got people from so many different backgrounds. After this cultural dimensions talked about different things. Some people are from a place where there's this power distance relationship, where there isn't co-ownership. We want one leader who's in charge, makes the decisions, and we're meant to all follow. And that's how we see how it works. A friend of mine moved into that culture and had his first meeting where he's going to brainstorming, we need ideas, we're going to talk about this. And after 30 minutes of not getting any engagement, one of the employees spoke up and said, you're the boss. Do you or do you not know what you're doing? You know, so from that perspective, he's trying to make us do his work and it's above our pay grade. And that was like for him quite a shock. And he thought, no, I'm trying to develop everyone. You tell us what to do, we do what we do. So there are people who come from those places and you will see it in the dynamic between the parents and the children when they come in. You know, that's the absolute authorities, children are still to be seen and not heard. This is how things work. So having a conversation with them will be slightly different. Then we have those who have like short-term goals. This is about what we can get in the here and now. And others, very long-term, it's about legacy. It's also about preserving the traditions of the past. There are those who actually believe, no, it's about challenging everything. And we need to change. How are we going to make things happen if we don't change what's there? It influences how people think, how they act, how they interact. That level of awareness, I think everyone has to have to be able to settle in the workplace. And to that extent, I think it's everyone's responsibility. Because, you know, the leaders won't be in the staff room when the conversations happen. The leaders won't be in the classroom when the child is being misunderstood and not being well supported. The leaders, a lot of the low-level disciplinary complaints we get won't be down to misunderstandings like that. So I think it's everyone. Everyone has a part to play in making that place work.
Thank you. Yeah, setting out what we expect, collectively engaging.
So again, just like health and safety, it's everybody's responsibility, and we, as individuals, we need to take the onus upon ourselves to make sure, yes, there may be a policy in place, but morally and ethically, what is the right thing? So if you come across bias in the workplace, or one of your learners mentions something, you think, okay, well, that's not quite right, it's addressing it and having the courage to address it or report it as well, so making sure you've got the mechanisms in place to report it. So I would say it's a collective responsibility, and we need to make sure that there are leaders in the organisation. This goes back to the individual point. So there's individuals who are actually enforcing it. But when I say enforcing it, it's not something to be afraid of, policy procedure to be afraid of. It's actually there to create inclusivity, to make sure you're creating that holistic environment that everybody will thrive in. There's an article that I read, and if you actually have proper EDI policies in place and you're actually lived in policies, it will actually increase innovation, profitability, retention, you're more likely to attract a diverse talent pool that is actually more collaborative and inclusive. One of the examples which I didn't mention earlier on, so for example, we've recently advertised for a finance support officer in our team, and there's a lady from the school that's actually supporting us because we're quite a small central trustee, and we've just recently academised 2 schools. So I encouraged her to apply, and she hasn't had a job interview for 10 years now, and so she's a young one, she's got a child at home who's I think about 1. I encouraged her to apply, so we went through the job spec. and she's had to think about it, and she said to me, I don't think I want to apply because I want to have another child. And I said, that's absolutely fine. And as a manager, I could have automatically applied by saying, okay, well, I don't want to apply, I don't want you to apply for the job, or if you do apply, I won't appoint you because I know you're going to go on maternity leave. And what I actually did, I went one step further, and I'm not sure if our people and talent team, which is the equivalent of HR, or the CFO would have agreed with this, but to create that psychological safety for her, as a manager, I went one step further, and she said to her, that's fine if you want to go away and go off and take time off to have another baby, that's absolutely fine, and I would encourage you to have your babies quite close together because I think it's quite nice for your children to grow up like that. So even though I created that psychological safety for her, unfortunately she didn't apply, but then I felt as though morally and ethically I created that open and honest culture and environment where she felt safe, because for her to share that with me was important, because I don't think she would have shared that with the CFO or the CEO or people and talent. So I think for me the fact that I've created that psychological safety in the team was really important. And then this is the individual responsibility of ensuring you implement a workforce which is inclusive, and you encourage your employees to actually come up to you and speak to you about things like this. They do feel recognised, valued and appreciated.
And I think we've all talked about recruitment and retention being a crisis point for us, so if we can't do that, we're at risk of losing good talent, aren't we, from our organisations. Tamsin, what's your view? I would imagine similar.
So I think it's both. So I think sometimes if we talk about institutional racism, for example, what can happen is that we then forget our own individual responsibility as contributing to the structures that uphold institutional racism, for example. So I think there is a collective responsibility for us to act and to make a change. And I would say with caution, because without doing the prior work, the race literacy work, the work on yourself to understand where your privileges may lie, where they may rest, what your own experiences have been and how they've shaped the way that you undertake your practice, then you can actually end up doing more damage, because you can end up doing something that you think is a good approach but actually can be ineffective or quite dangerous. So I would recommend looking at people like Shireen Daniels, who actually did the review of the Met Police and racism, and she asked some really big questions around what do we mean when we talk about collective responsibility, around kind of the structural areas that are causing this inequity, to try and unpick that, and then to think about these big questions like, what are we willing to change? And of course that is a collective responsibility, but if we haven't done that individual work first, then we have that danger of creating more harm. So Shireen Daniels warns us that whilst we may have read something and think, let's jump in with 2 feet, let's get on this, don't. Do the work first. Make sure you're racially literate, make sure you're literate in terms of your understanding of disability and inclusion more broadly. So both.
Yeah, so I'm going to quickly comment on the back of that. Reminds me of a time when I sat with an executive head teacher. I was job hunting at the time, and I sat up and I said, I think I keep answering this question wrong. Everywhere I go, they keep asking me, like, we've got this person in our mat who wouldn't accept you. And in one case, the lady went, actually he's racist, so what are you going to do about it? And I said, I keep answering that question wrong. And he put a shock on his face, like, nobody should be asking you that. And I remember thinking, oh, they always ask me that, especially when the job's outside London, And he kept thinking there is no right answer. I think they just want to be sure you're not going to cause trouble, And I think I just clocked that and places where people start, we call me old-fashioned, but that's usually a telltale sign that there is actually some work to be done.
And I think, Tamsin, you obviously gave some really good advice, but if you're sitting in the audience now thinking, yeah, actually I want to go back to school and I want to reflect and I want to make sure we've got some good practice in our policies, where would you've talked about that report, but is there the Institute for Equity, is there somewhere we can go for advice? Are there good practice pieces we can look Where would you signpost, or is that?
Absolutely, there is. So I work at the Institute for Equity, and we deliver online programs, and we have an MBA in equity leadership, but we also have a schools offer. So we have kind of bundles of workshops that we can bring to schools, and I think this is where it's really important in thinking about that collectiveness, because if one person comes and does a course, then yes, they can go back and they can work with colleagues in their institution, but will you get that consistency? So we do offer workshops that we can deliver in groups so that everybody is having that same message, but also the opportunity to discuss any concerns they may have within the implementation of it, so which will be unique to your context. So if you wanted to take a look at our website, there is a lot of information around those programs, but there's also thought pieces, and there's also a podcast. So if you don't feel ready yet to take an MBA or a level 6 qualification, there are those little thought pieces that talk about key issues for school leaders, for business leaders, around equity, diversity and inclusion. And I would also just like to recommend Nova Reed's book, The Good Ally. So this is a Trojan horse of a book. So you pick up the book, you think The Good Ally, this is going to be a nice read about how I can be this supportive person, and actually it is hard-hitting stuff, and it will challenge everyone that reads it, I think, because you have to really look inside yourself and the steps that you're taking to think about your own practice, your own thought process, the things that you might be doing that you think are great but could inadvertently be causing harm. Which is a great audio version as well. So yeah, I would recommend looking at our website and Nova Reed. She's fantastic.
Thank you. Just want people to feel they've got something to take away from today. I think we heard earlier, didn't we, from Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, that role models are really important. So how can schools ensure that they have diversity within their workforce? You've been doing a lot of recruitment. How are you ensuring, we talked about barriers earlier, that we're attracting diversity?
I guess it's making sure you're sharing those vision and values. So most job adverts, it states the vision and values, but make sure you're living and breathing those values, so there's authenticity there, so prospective candidates can see that, and then they're attracted to the school as well. There was a Glassdoor conducted a study, and I think it was 37%, or was it 67%, of candidates, 67% of job seekers actually prioritised EDI practices within school, and that's what actually encouraged them to apply. So it shouldn't be something that's overlooked, because I was quite surprised with those statistics myself. So from so make sure you've got diversity in the workplace. I think it's making sure you're employing those leaders who represent what you think EDI looks like. So it's not just in terms of what it looks like when you look at an individual, it's those things that you can't see, for example. So those traits that you can't see, but you're still making adaptations for it. And then making sure that your leaders are educated. So just because you've done the equality and diversity training, you've ticked a box, but actually having refresher training, attending courses, making sure that you're fully aware of all the changes and the things that you shouldn't be saying that aren't PC, for example, and then challenging those behaviours in the workplace in the right manner, making people, so it's an education piece, rather than reprimanding somebody in the workforce for saying something which could be considered racist or not appropriate. It's having that conversation, just making them aware. You do realise by saying X, it could mean Y. So just being mindful of what leaders could be saying, and educating staff to make sure that they're using the correct words. And it's not being afraid of having banter or having conversation in the workplace, but just making everybody aware. And I think if you encourage that kind of environment of holisticity, I think staff will feel more safe. And it's going back to that psychological safety. And I think if you've got a workforce that is naturally EDI compliant, if you like, or they're living and breathing those values, they're leading by example, and that's what the learners will see. And I think that's really important. I think it's important for our learners to see, being from an ethnic minority background, prospects. So I think we tend to feel as though we've got more to prove, but I think if your learners can see that actually there's an adult in the workplace who looks like me and has done well, then they will aspire to be that person. And I think it's making sure you're unlocking elements that could be barriers to ensure people can thrive. So, for example, there's a recent advert which I saw at a museum, and one of the things that it mentioned was being a disability confident employer. So one of the things, and this was something that was quite new to me in terms of what I learned, but apparently if you do have a disability, you're guaranteed an interview. So it's not just about reasonable adjustments and giving you an application that's got bigger text or providing you the accessibility to attend the interview. It's making sure you've got access to be able to you guarantee that access, but then put all the other things in place as well. And I think that for me was quite important. And I think, to be honest with you, within the application, it actually said if you do have additional needs, there was actually a direct personal email address. I think based on the points that you mentioned, Abby, I think that was a big tick for you, because you don't want to share personal details with generic email address. You want to feel as though you're speaking to somebody who's trained, who is an expert in the field, and who understands this protected characteristic, or this characteristic which is unusual, that requires potentially reasonable adjustments.
Thank you. We should come to you. I think you talked about data and evidence, didn't you? Looking at disciplinaries and how you were looking at that. What did you do as a consequence? Did it sort of encourage you to do training or changes?
Yes, it encouraged us to actually look at, like I said, we went back to the notes, and for the staff who were still there, we had conversations with them about the experiences. The thing with interrogating data is that you've got to be brave and ready for conversations and the feedback you're going to get. One of the most memorable ones I remember was we had an LGBTQ staff member on the SLT who felt he didn't really have a voice. So I had a really good conversation with him, and he went out and spoke to the tutor groups, had a really good assembly. And one of the kids, now the school at the time was actually majority Muslim, and they were talking about an African country where I think there was a death penalty for LGBTQ, and people were supportive of that. Now, this particular child from a very, very ultra-conservative family was hearing that his classmates wanted him dead. That was what he was hearing. That was not the conversation the kids thought they were having. But one, he hadn't come out to his family, and he feared he couldn't because they're going to kill him. And then he comes to school and goes, yeah, my classmates want me dead as well. Or even my close friends want me dead. And these are the consequences we don't think about. So when he had the assembly and this person went to have a conversation with him, we had to do the tutor groups, had a really big LGBTQ assembly day. That was tricky in itself because it was a non-uniform day, and some children thought, if I don't come to school in uniform, then I am validating this thing that my faith tells me not to. That gave rise to another round of conversations about, no, you're not validating. You're just telling him we don't want you dead. You belong here. It was actually quite amazing, but we had a whole year of conversations around that.
So you did challenge that, you unpacked that as a school,
Yes,
as an organisation.
We did. It was hard work, but it was worth it.
And it felt that there was that inclusive excellence at the end of that as a consequence.
It was, yes.
It was a constant iterative process by the sounds of it.
We actually introduced that on the timetable, on the list of books we had. Reason why we would have a very, what pride would look like to people who are observant, what messages we want to send, what we think we're supposed to be against versus what other people are hearing. There was, I used to go to church, and I remember someone came out like, oh yeah, church people, there's no hate like Christian love. And I thought, oh, that's a bit much. But there is, the message that's getting out there, and what we want it to look like. And we also updated our public sector equality duty to include metrics for those groups, which I thought was powerful.
Thanks, Annie. Can we come to you, Tamsin, for the last word? Because I'm conscious that we're nearly at lunchtime.
Yeah, I think I'll summarise it as making sure that when colleagues come into the workplace, that we understand what they need to thrive. And as a leader, the first question that I would ask someone in my team would be, what can I give you to make sure that you can thrive? And I think there are various approaches that, you know, I've seen across the country. For example, I was the chair of a network, the Leeds Learning Alliance network, where there was recruitment of alumni from the secondary school, so 20% of their workforce were their student alumni. And that meant that they really reflected the community that they were working in. So it's finding alternative ways to recruit, but making sure once you recruit people, that actually you're ensuring that they've got what they need. And that's what equity is about. It's not providing the same for everyone, it's recognising that in order to thrive, we have to recognise difference.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, for listening. I think the key takeaways we discussed earlier, because we're going to take questions, but we're going to stay, aren't we, on stage if we want to come and ask any questions of our panellists. We said everyone's responsibility, EDI is everyone's responsibility. Go back and check, are your policies authentic and lived, didn't we? Engagement with stakeholders to ensure everyone has a say. So, you know, if we're going to have these policies, everybody needs to be involved in their development. And we said, plan, do, review, and evaluate, didn't we? So I hope that's been helpful to everybody. Thank you for being in our session. And it is lunch, but we will stay on stage when everyone's come to talk to us. Thank you.